Chapter 5. If you have ever taken a long-awaited journey to a far-flung destination, you may have encountered a painful condition known as holiday fatigue. This is the phenomenon whereby, after weeks of excitedly shopping for straw hats and suitable luggage, making lists of what to pack and what to leave behind, purchasing bug repellent and checking weather reports, and then traveling by foot, airplane, tramp steamer, hot air balloon, or whatever you please, you arrived finally in Mahi Mahi or Awoo or some other rare and spectacular locale, only to discover that you would much prefer to be at home. You have not gone mad. You recall your name perfectly well, you know what year it is, and can correctly identify the capitals of at least a few mid-sized European nations. But your wanderlust seems to have wandered off. The Hawaiian shirts fairly scream to be put on, the sunscreen smells appealingly like coconut, and yet you spend the day in bed, glued to the hotel television. Instead of breaking out the crampons and pickaxe and scaling the legendarily slippery Mount Crisco, as you have so keenly been looking forward to doing, you stumble to the vending machine down the hall to purchase stale candy and lukewarm soda. Soon, even that pathetic excursion requires more zip than you can muster. No one is immune to holiday fatigue, and it is contagious. One grumpy traveler can make the rest of her party miserable before the station wagon has left the driveway. So far, Penelope showed no symptoms. She had slept like a rock in the small upstairs bedroom next to the children's room, and awoken refreshed. She'd spent the early part of the morning happily engrossed in her Hicksbees, planning her first full day in London in that eager, list-making sort of mood that starts people whistling jaunty tunes without even knowing they're doing it. The Incorrigibles, alas, were a different matter. "London, no. Go home," Cassiopeia announced when Penelope asked her for the second time to run a comb through her hair. "But we haven't even begun to see London yet," Penelope replied with mild alarm. "We see London, too much London. Miles, miles." Beowulf yawned widely. He'd already put on his clothes, but his shoes were on the wrong feet, a mistake that he hadn't made for some weeks, and that he now seemed in no hurry to correct. If Alexander had a complaint, it remained unspoken, but that was because he had so far refused to get out of bed. The covers were drawn completely over his face. Only the hank of sleep-mussed hair poking through the blanket revealed his presence. Penelope didn't like the look of this one bit. Thanks to Mr. Hicksby, she had devised a highly educational walking tour that would allow her to drop a letter at the post office for Miss Charlotte Mortimer, followed by a brisk ramble through St. James's Park, where she planned to give her pupils a brief lesson on plant identification. They would then proceed to Buckingham Palace, arriving at the time of day when the light would be best for sketching. Afterward, tea and crumpets at an inexpensive cafe, then a long stroll that would take them past both Houses of Parliament, Big Ben, London Bridge, and St. Paul's Cathedral. Their walk would conclude at the brand-new British Museum, where they would spend the remainder of the afternoon touring the galleries and perhaps pop in on a lecture or two. It was an ambitious plan, to be sure. In particular, a lecture at the museum might be pushing their luck, but Penelope was raring to see the collection of overuse of symbolism in minor historical portraits that the Hicksby's guide recommended so highly, and wanted to squeeze it in somehow. And with so many wonderful places to visit, how could any of them be put off until tomorrow? Penelope thought she'd planned the day from top to bottom, but she hadn't planned that the children would be in a funk. And so she realized her plan must be altered. She took a deep breath and said, "Who wants breakfast?" All three Incorrigibles perked up slightly at the suggestion, but they were still too grumpy to reply. "Well, I certainly do." She rose and walked to the door. "I will go downstairs and fetch some. When I return, I expect all three of you to be out of bed, hair combed, faces washed, and fully dressed. If you're ready before I return, please practice your cursive letters. I've already tacked a helpful diagram on the wall." This was another example of Penelope's optimism, for the two younger Incorrigibles were sloppy printers at best, and Cassiopeia struggled mightily with the spelling of her own name, and even Alexander was prone to mixing up his P's and Q's. Yet Penelope believed that the best approach was to set a high standard and encourage the children to jump for it. It was the way she'd been taught, after all. As Agatha Swanburne once observed, "When a big leap is required, a running start makes all the difference, so get moving." She left without waiting for a reply. Penelope had no idea what she might find in the kitchen. She hadn't seen Miss Clark, and all the servants were frantically preparing the house for the arrival of Lord and Lady Ashton. But even if there's no breakfast made, she thought determinedly, surely a lane called Muffinshire will be equipped with a charming little bakery somewhere close by. Down the stairs she went, for the servants' and children's quarters were upstairs, past floor after floor of parlors and sitting rooms, dark-paneled libraries, and extra bedrooms for guests. There was a whole floor for the private use of the lord and lady of the house, with spacious bedchambers, dressing rooms, and the most newfangled lavatories imaginable, including actual flush toilets and slipper-shaped tubs that could heat up their own bathwater. Finally, she reached the bottommost floor, which was the domain of the cook, the scullery maids, and the laundresses. Although the cook was nowhere in sight, she discovered a big pot of porridge keeping warm on the kitchen hearth. She filled the bowls herself, sprinkling each with cinnamon and sugar, and since she didn't know how to work the dumbwaiter, carried the meal all the way back up those many stairs on a tray. To her great relief, the children were waiting for her in the room. They were dressed, though still looking glum. Alexander had stubbornly kept his blanket wrapped around him like a cape, and no one had taken a stab at the cursive letters. Penelope waited until the Incorrigibles had finished eating their porridge before speaking. "Wasn't that delicious?" she said, stacking the empty bowls on the tray. "I do so love the taste of cinnamon. Now, wash your hands and put on your coats. Quick, quick! We have an exciting day in store." There were whimpers of protest, but Penelope paid them no mind. "In the first place, I wish to send a note to Miss Mortimer, letting her know that we have arrived in London and are eager to see her. We shall deliver it to the post office ourselves. Afterward—" She paused, for even she suspected that her grand scheme for the day might be enough to send anyone scuttling back under the covers. "We shall go exploring," she finished, leaving it at that. "I have devised a walking tour. It will be very educational." "Sextant?" Beowulf asked nervously. "Astrolabe?" "No, we do not need a sextant, nor an abacus. Cassiopeia, please put that back." Penelope patted the Hicksby's guide with confidence. "Yesterday was a bit of a muddle, but I believe I have the hang of things now, and after the post office we will proceed to Buckingham Palace." She thought she saw a glimmer of interest in her three pupils, and added, "That's where Queen Victoria and Prince Albert live, you know?" Under the table, where he no doubt thought he would not be seen, Beowulf quickly switched his shoes around to the correct feet. "Postcard of the palace?" Alexander asked, letting the blanket fall to the floor. Cassiopeia leapt at her brother's suggestion. "Nutsy, nutsy, nutsawoo!" she howled excitedly, and offered Penelope her coat. "Good girl. Think of what we shall write to Nutsawoo. Surely he would be disappointed if we came all the way to London and did nothing but mope around the house." Penelope felt slightly silly pretending she cared about Nutsawoo's opinion. After all, not even Edith Ann Purvington wrote postcards to Rainbow. Clever pony that he was, she thought as she helped the little girl squirm her arms into the sleeves. But children's imagination must be indulged. Actually, Penelope was mistaken, for there was a book late in the Giddy Up Rainbow series, in which the pony-crazed heroine, Edith Ann Pevington, did in fact send a picture postcard to Rainbow while taking a round-the-world voyage with her eccentric aunt. Alas, Edith Ann Takes a Trip While Rainbow Stays Home was not one of the best sellers in the otherwise popular series, which explains perhaps why Penelope had overlooked it. In any case, her new plan worked. Thanks to a hot breakfast, a bit of kind but firm handling, and a helpful, if imaginary, nudge from a squirrel, all three Incorrigibles had managed to shake off their holiday fatigue and were now ready to venture forth. As they proceeded to the stairs, Alexander extended his hand to Penelope in an offer to take charge of the Hicksby's guide. "Knack for navigation," he boasted. Penelope suppressed a smile as she remembered her new acquaintance Simon, who had said the very same thing the day before. What were the odds they might run into him again? London was an enormous city, of course, but for some reason she didn't think they'd seen the last of Simon. And although she felt a bit skittish about letting the Hicksbys out of her sight, she handed the guidebook over to Alexander with only the slightest hesitation. "Very well, but mind you keep a close eye on it, Alexander. Now, off we go, children, to the post office, and then Buckingham Palace." The London General Post Office was so impressive that Penelope could hardly imagine how Buckingham Palace might surpass it. Until they arrived at the palace, that is. Then she understood quite well, for there's a significant difference between a post office and a palace. And by this, one should infer no disrespect to professional mail carriers, who serve an indispensable function in modern society and are much appreciated by all reasonable letter-writing people. "Look," Cassiopeia pointed. "Home." "No, that's not Ashton Place," Penelope corrected. Although Cassiopeia did have a point. Both Buckingham Palace and Ashton Place were fine examples of the neoclassical style of architecture, which is to say that they were boxy and rather plain, in a symmetrical, fluted column sort of way. But Buckingham Palace was inarguably grander, for it was a palace after all, and the royal family actually lived there, at least when they were in town. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert and their many children, and one presumes the children's governesses. Penelope felt suddenly curious. Who was this royal governess? Where had she gone to school, and how did she go about her work? Educating children raised by wolves was one thing, but to be put in charge of actual princes and princesses? That was a job for a Swanburn girl, if there ever was one. Somehow, though, Penelope doubted that any poor, bright female would be chosen for such an exalted position. But that's quite enough wondering about that, she told herself, for they had arrived at the gate of the palace, and it was no time to go off on a tangent. Let us see what Mr. Hicksby has to tell us about this architectural landmark, she said to the children, flipping through the guidebook. I, for one, can never remember if those triangular bits above the columns are called pediments or impediments. Ah, here it is, Buckingham Palace. It says, the royal house is warm and fine. The cold and hungry wait in line. Poem, Beowulf observed. You are correct, Beowulf. Penelope shut the guide. She, too, had noticed that most of the entries were in the form of little poems, except for the one about the Gallery 17 at the British Museum, which went on for pages. How curious. I wonder what it means. Wait in line. Look. Alexander tugged at her sleeve and pointed. Snaking all the way round the side of the palace and then back again was a long line of sad-faced, shabbily dressed people. There were old men and women, young ones too, and many with small children huddled around their legs. They had an air of worry about them, as if the dark cloud of difficulty and disappointment was hanging low over their heads. Need a ticket? A man's voice startled Penelope, and she found herself slipping the guidebook out of sight beneath her cloak. Alexander, Beowulf, and Cassiopeia each took a step closer to her. A ticket for what? Ticket for the line. He was a small, wiry fellow in a long checkered coat. Should have gotten here earlier, so today's tickets are long gone. Cassiopeia peeked out from behind Penelope's skirt. Tickle why? The man lifted an eyebrow at Cassiopeia. She wants to know why all the people are waiting, Penelope translated. Foreigners, huh? He cast a sideways look at Cassiopeia, and then clasped his hands in front of him and rolled his eyes heavenward. Better days, miss. They're waiting for better days to come. Good luck to 'em, I say. Until then, a ticket'll get 'em a packet of leftover food from the palace kitchens. He rubbed his tummy and spoke slowly and loudly for the sake of the children. They're waiting for grub. It's the pauper's food line. That's generous, I suppose, Penelope replied. Leftovers to eat were certainly better than nothing, but for a whole family to wait in line for scraps, it didn't seem right to her. You don't need a ticket, then? The man looked at the children over with an appraising eye. Their hair was still in a tangle, but their clothes were of decent quality and in good repair. No offense, miss. Sorry to trouble you. Penelope's eyes kept being drawn back to the hungry people in line. She wondered how long they'd been waiting. I don't understand, she said to the man. I thought you said today's tickets had all been disposed of? Oh, they're gone, yes, long gone. Still, for the right person at the right price, a ticket can always be found. He turned over his hand and flashed what appeared to be an entire roll of tickets, which quickly disappeared into one of his many pockets. Penelope could scarcely believe it. Those tickets are meant to be charity for the poor. You said so yourself, she scolded. I'm sure it's not right for you to take money for them. You ought to be ashamed. But the man had already disappeared into the crowd, still searching for some poor soul desperate enough to pay for the free tickets he'd somehow hoarded. In the words of Agatha Swanburn, Don't look now, but everything is about to change. This incident was a perfect example of what the wise woman must have meant, for although Penelope had begun the day feeling positively chipper, she now felt herself in a state that can only be described as high dudgeon. "How infuriating," she cried, to no one in particular. "I am quite sure if Queen Victoria knew of this man's dishonesty, Her Majesty would be very unhappy indeed." And with that, Penelope started to march briskly towards the palace. "Lamawoo!" the children called in alarm as they chased after her. "Where? Where?" "I am going to request that a message be delivered to Queen Victoria," she explained, without breaking her stride. "Victoria, woo!" the children howled excitedly. Even as they scampered after their governess, the boys began practicing their bows and socially useful phrases. "Greetings, Your Majesty, how do you do? Lovely weather, the pleasure is mine," and so on, while Cassiopeia curtsied so low she toppled over and had to scurry to catch up. "I doubt we'll get to meet her. The Queen's very busy," Penelope said. "But someone must tell her what's going on. Perhaps there's a constable who can help us." She looked around and saw a uniformed guard standing stiffly just outside the main gate. He was not a police officer exactly, but he seemed to be in some official capacity. Surely he would do just as well. Sir, may I speak with you for a moment?" The guard stood motionless. Not even his eyes moved. "Pardon me, sir," Penelope repeated, rather forcefully. "There's a matter of some urgency which I would like brought to Her Majesty's attention. Can you help me?" Unmoved by her plea, the guard stared straight ahead. For a moment, Penelope wondered if he might be a statue. The most striking thing about his uniform was the hat. It was enormous, for one thing, and in the shape of a barrel, and seemed to be made completely out of fur. Now that Penelope was standing so close, she noticed how the mass of fur covered the top half of the guard's face in a way that made him seem not quite like a person at all. In fact, if not for the rest of the uniform, he might easily be mistaken for, "Ah, bear! Bear! Ow!" The children let loose a frenzy of howls. Beowulf paused long enough to take a deep sniff. "A bear!" he yelled conclusively, pointing at the guard's head. Cassiopeia curled into a tight crouch, ready to spring at the poor fellow. Alexander bared his teeth and emitted the most vicious growl imaginable. "A bear!" As one, they pounced. "No, children, stop! Don't attack!" Penelope was sick with fear, for the guard, being a guard, was armed with a musket. The weapon was now at his shoulder, and the muzzle was aimed straight at the Incorrigibles. Without thinking about the consequences, Penelope hurled herself at the guard. "They're only children," she cried. "Don't shoot!" "Children? A pack of wolf cubs, more like it." It was the guard speaking from someplace close by. For some reason, Penelope could no longer see him, for she was suddenly in the dark. "Listen up, miss. It's my job to guard the Queen's palace, and guard it I will. I'm on strict orders not to converse with the tourists, so you've already got me in trouble. Easy there, little fella. The hat's pure Canadian brown bear, and they cost a king's ransom. I'd hate to explain to my commanding officer why I needed a new one." Only then did Penelope realize that her eyes were squeezed shut in terror. Very slowly she opened them, whereupon she beheld an astonishing sight. Cassiopeia had all 4 limbs wrapped around the guard's leg, with her teeth sunk into his trousers. Alexander dangled from the musket as if it were part of a jungle gym, while Beowulf perched on the man's head, wrestling vigorously with the hat. "A bear?" Cassiopeia asked curiously, gazing upward. "It was a bear once. Would you like to pet it?" The guard reached up and removed the hat, Beowulf and all, and held it out to the girl. Alexander slid off the musket barrel and dropped to the ground. "Pardon me," he said, bowing to the guard. "How do you do?" Then both boys bowed, and Cassiopeia curtsied. "Pleasure is mine, woof," she said. The guard was clearly impressed. "That's very well said. I wish my boy had nice manners like you lot do." He turned to Penelope. "I can't help you with the Queen, but if you have a suggestion, you can leave it in the suggestion box. That's the best I can do." Another time, perhaps. Thank you. I apologize for the disturbance." Penelope herded the 3 Incorrigibles away from the gate and across the plaza, until she spotted an empty park bench in a quiet spot. There she sat down, for her knees were shaking beneath her skirt, and she didn't want the children to know. The children, on the other hand, were now wonderfully energized and arguing about where to go next.
St. James, Big Ben, British Museum,
Cassiopeia suggested. Your enthusiasm is admirable, children. Penelope patted her forehead with a handkerchief. But I must confess I've had quite enough sightseeing for one day. It was possible that delayed onset case of holiday fatigue was finally catching up with the unusually plucky young governess. Or perhaps the sight of the three incorrigible children once again facing down the barrel of a musket. Well, that was simply too much for her to bear. The children were clearly disappointed, but their governess had made up her mind. And then they knew very well that was it. In any case, it had been a good while since breakfast, and all four of them were in need of tea and something sweet to nibble on. So without further discussion, and with Alexander still in charge of the Hicksby's guide, Penelope and the incorrigible children headed home. No doubt it was the holiday fatigue at work, but Penelope could scarcely bring herself to sightsee as they walked. She'd expected London to be a glittering metropolis full of culture and learning. Instead, it seemed like the forest of Ashton Place, an ominous landscape full of danger at every turn. It wasn't until her thoughts had strayed to Ashton Place in this unexpected fashion, and Alexander had successfully navigated them back to number 12 Muffinshire Lane, that Penelope realized, in all the excitement, they had completely forgotten to buy a postcard for Natsawoo.